Chapter 32. With only half a dozen saints to go, and Raimi glorying in what he had found in his personal living space, Irene watched and listened as a tall, dark man slowly approached the altar and fell to his knees. His works were tested and polished by the fire, then formed into a beautiful crown of life, which Jesus gave him, following an embrace and a well done. Just as the Virgin was chosen, Jesus said, so were you, my earthly Father. This reflects your perseverance through many trials for my sake. But at first I was angry, Joseph said, frustrated, confused. I did not respond as one chosen. As soon as you knew the truth, you gave of yourself for me and my mother, and treated me as if I were your own. It always felt to me as if you were. Irene enjoyed peeking in on Joseph's life and eavesdropping on his conversations with Mary, with the angel, and with Jesus at various ages. She couldn't wait to test the features in her mansion and physically enter the world at any place and era she wished. For the first time in his life, Christopher Smith understood what it meant to be beside oneself. His private agony was so acute that it was as if he had left the very presence of his body and could see himself from afar. There he sat, in his usual spot behind the cockpit controls he knew so well, and yet his soul wrestled within. He made himself sick. Something about this horrible universal incident had forced him to shine a spotlight on his character, and he could not hide from himself. His life was a waste. He was worthless, and he was desperate to connect with his real wife, his boys. Why? Why now, after all these years? What could Jane do? What did the boys have to offer, other than some theological treatise they had learned at church or mumbo-jumbo camp? And even if they could tell him this was indeed somehow connected with God, what would that do for him? It was too late to become one of those. He had traveled his own road much too long and much too far. God could never forgive what he had done, could not really change who he was. It wasn't answers Chris sought from his wife and kids. It was some remedy from this enormous loneliness. Why did he feel so isolated? Had he done this to himself? Of course he had. He had made Jane in particular an emotional hostage, and he might as well have abandoned his sons. They had offered little protest, apparently not needing him, and that was okay. That helped assuage any guilt. Maybe his presence and support, being the sorry excuse for a man he knew himself to be, should not be missed. But now, he needed them. How might they respond to such a cry of want? He knew them. They were good people at heart. Even with what he had become, they would rally round him, be there for him, despite the fact that he had been so detached from their lives for so long. Chris didn't know what he would do if he could not somehow reach them soon. I am most unworthy, the man said, who now knelt before the altar of flame. You were a doubter, Thomas, Jesus said, but I forgave you of that, and once you were convinced, you became most energetic and devout. See how you atone for your disbelief? Your works have tested favorably. The stones will make a beautiful crown of righteousness. You were one who wanted to know where I was going, so you could be here with me. And here I am, Thomas said. And here you are. Funny how a terrifying disaster changes a man's perspective, Rayford thought. Any thoughts, hopes, or desires for Hattie Durham now struck him as the most ludicrous ideas he had ever had. If she had thrown herself at him right then, he'd have cast her aside. Cold? Yes. Mean? That too. Rayford had, after all, been encouraging her for weeks. But what in the world had he been thinking? All he wanted now was to reunite with Irene and Chloe and Raimi. But deep in his gut, he feared the worst. That Chloe and he would be the only half of his family left. Rayford had told Hattie that he didn't know what was happening any more than she did. But the terrifying truth was that he knew all too well. Irene had been right. He and Chloe and most of his passengers had been left behind. 13-year-old Lionel Washington was proud of his mother, but for reasons other than that she seemed wise in the areas of forgiveness and acceptance. The truth was, with her job as Chicago bureau chief of Global Weekly magazine, she was the star of the family. Not just Lionel's family, but the whole Washington clan. They traced their roots to the Freedom Riders on the Underground Railway during the days of slavery, and many of his ancestors had been active in the civil rights movement, fighting for equal opportunities among the races. His mother was one who had proved that a person, regardless of her color or the housing project she had grown up in, could achieve and make something of herself if she really committed herself to it. Lucinda Washington told Lionel that she had been born and raised in a Cleveland ghetto, but "I loved to study, and that was my way out of the projects." She said she fell in love with reporting and writing. She had graduated from journalism school and worked her way up, finally, to Global Weekly. She made good money, even more than her husband Charles, who was a heavy equipment operator. He was as proud of her as anyone, and secretly, Lionel was proud of her too. But Lionel had another secret, and it caused him no end of anxiety. Lionel knew something no one else in the family even suspected. He was not really a Christian, even though the whole family history revolved around church. Family legend said his mother had taken him to church when he was less than a week old. Actually, he liked church a lot. Church was what the Washington family was all about, but Lionel knew it went deeper than that. His mother not only loved church, she also truly loved God, and Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Lionel admitted to his mother's younger brother, his uncle Andre, that he had never really become a Christian. Andre was the criminal of the family. Lionel told him, "Everybody thinks you're a Christian who has bad spells once in a while. They think I might become a preacher or a missionary someday. You ought to talk with your mother about this," Uncle Andre said. "I'd rather see you grow up like her than like me." "I can't. It'd kill her. She thinks I'm one of the best young Christians she knows. Hey, Uncle Andre, aren't you afraid it might be true and we might end up in hell?" Andre threw back his head and cackled that crazy laugh of his. "Now that I do not believe. I may have once, but I've outgrown that. Some of these stories and legends about what's going to happen at the end of the world, I don't know where the preachers get them. I can't imagine they're in the Bible." The evening before, the last time Lionel had seen his mother, she had pulled him close and said, "Isn't the Lord wonderful? Don't we have a great God, Aren't you glad to serve a God who loves you so much?" "Uh-huh," Lionel said. "Sure, Mama. Course I am." He felt terrible, like a hypocrite, like the liar he was. There was no clock in the basement of the Washington home where Lionel slept. The next morning it seemed too bright, too late when he awoke. He didn't feel like moving. He merely opened his eyes, squinted at the sun's rays that had somehow found their way through the tiny windows, and watched the dust dance in the columns of light. When the phone rang upstairs and Lionel heard no footsteps, he groaned and whipped off the blankets, marching up to answer it. It must have been really early for his mother to not be up yet, and his dad usually made some racket heading out. Lionel noticed that his dad's truck was still parked in front of the garage, where his mother's car was kept. Both still sleeping? Strange. The call was from Global Weekly, asking after his mother. Lionel was stunned to see that it was the middle of the morning. He could be the hero, the one who roused everyone so they wouldn't be even later for work. Lionel went from the kitchen through the dining room toward the stairs that led to the upstairs bedrooms. He noticed something in his peripheral vision. On his dad's easy chair lay his oversized terry cloth robe. Lionel stopped and stared. He had never known his father to take his robe off outside the bedroom. Mr. Washington considered it impolite to walk around in public in just his pajamas, even referring to his own family as the public. Maybe he'd been warm and shed his robe while half asleep, not thinking. But that wasn't like him. He'd always taken great pride in not being one of those husbands whose wife always has to trail him, picking up after him. Lionel's father's slippers sat on the floor in front of the chair. The robe lay neatly, arms draped on the sides of the chair, almost as if Dad's elbows still rested there. When Lionel saw the pajama legs extending from the bottom of the robe and hanging just above the slippers, it was obvious that his father had disappeared right out of his pajamas and robe. It was as if life had switched to slow motion. Lionel was not aware of his body as he carefully advanced, holding his breath and feeling only the pounding of his heart. The harsh sunlight shone on the robe and picked up sparkling glints of something where Dad's lap should have been. Lionel knelt and stared at his father's tiny contact lenses, his wristwatch, his wedding ring, his dental fillings, and his hearing aid. Lionel's hands shook as he forced himself to exhale before he exploded. He felt his lips quiver and was aware of screams he could not let out. He crept forward on his knees and opened the robe to find his dad's pajamas still buttoned all the way up. Lionel recoiled and sat back, his feet under him. He lowered his face to between his knees and sobbed. If this was what he feared it was, he knew what he would find upstairs. He ran to the stairs and bounded up 2 at a time. The master bedroom was more than he could bear. His parents' bed was still made, his mother's nightclothes draped on one side, where it was obvious she had been kneeling in prayer. How Lionel wished he had been taken to heaven with his family, and that he had been found reading his Bible or praying when Jesus came. Only for an instant had Lionel wondered if he was dreaming. He knew better. This was real. This was the truth. All doubt and question had disappeared. His family had been raptured, as his church, his pastor, and his parents had taught. And he had been left behind.